Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry that took me a little while to get the show on the road today. We'll go about an hour, and we'll kind of go through this piece by piece. Mr. Producer has the show notes, and he's going to be posting those in a second, so we get kind of a sense of where we're going. Let's see here. Yeah, I think. Well, there's sort of a lot of things to be said at once today, and I think we should just be kind of like mindful not to take up too much time. I think we'll go about an hour today, maybe more, maybe less, depending. I've got my Turkish tea here, um, getting ready for a birthday party that is being thrown in my honor tomorrow. I will be 37 years old, which is a pretty incredible age to be. Uh, it happens quick, those of you who are younger. It happens quick. I wanted to maybe say a few quick words, first and foremost, about the ceasefire. Now, it's my contention that the ceasefire is not really real, or it's maybe a better way of putting it is it's a kind of lull in the killing. And I don't know if you guys got the chance to watch the CBS News setup the other day, but it was quite something to behold. The way in which Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff were kind of treated as this, as these sort of like great negotiators, these sort of amazing figures. I have my doubts as to whether or not that's true. But of course, it was interesting to see CBS News, of all places, in 60 Minutes, make that argument now that Barry Weiss is there. We should maybe kind of go into like why I think this, what my kind of general sense is, just kind of like watching the 60 Minutes special. I posted some of the things already on my timeline, and I'll maybe put up a few just in a second. Let's see here. Let me put this up, share that. I also included, I've been including a few things here and there about kind of what I'm just generally thinking. Here we go. So what's clear to me is that there was a kind of deal structured with the Qataris, and that is kind of like the real story of what actually happened. And that the more we kind of like want to hide that from the public, and in particular, there was a kind of deal structured with the Turks, I think the less the public at large will actually buy what's been going on. I think in the main, the best way to kind of think about this is we should think of Qatar as a kind of place where lots of different countries can intersect with the U.S. government, at a kind of place where Netanyahu really desperately wants to control those gas fields. And my contention is that were it not for the Qataris kind of saying to Donald Trump, hey, you got to fix this. You got to fix what's going on with your boy Bibi, that this conflict would very much still be going on. And I think it's a Cold War phase right now. Now, I want to be kind of mindful about what I think is really going on here. I take the Greater Israel people seriously. I don't think that they're just like a whole bunch of crazy people. I think that they genuinely want to remake the entire Middle East. And I think in particular, they want a Greater Israel. Like, this is an objective of theirs. They want to build a kind of regional hegemon in the Middle East, the Israelis do. And they want to use the gas resources and the material resources of the Middle East, particularly the oil resources of, like, say, Saudi Arabia or UAE, as the kind of financial backing for it. So you can kind of think of it as sort of Israeli muscle, and the gas and oil from the Middle East. I don't think any of that's going to work, and I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing kind of the Israelis on their last legs, and so they're getting increasingly desperate and starting to kill lots of people. And I think you could see the kind of pressure that's been going on to get the kind of more religious Israelis to serve in the military, and kind of they're not really inclined to. They're not really inclined to push that. They're not really inclined to get people to serve in the military. And so I think we're going to see a lot more kind of internal conflict within Israel. and that this is going to be the story moving forward. I don't know if you saw today, but Yair Lapid, the former prime minister, who represents about half of the members of parliament in the Knesset, he was in a sort of fight the other day with Netanyahu, arguing quite rightly that if it were not for Netanyahu, that more of the hostages would have actually come home alive. And then Netanyahu is basically prolonging the conflict, as he's prolonging almost all the conflicts in the Middle East, for his own political benefit. Now, I think we should kind of understand the protests that have been happening by the kind of Jewish world in the United States as a kind of check on the Israelis, and as a kind of check generally on the idea that like there's some inexhaustible number of soldiers that could really, go and fight in the Middle East. I think what really came down to this was a fatigue, that there were sort of too many soldiers fighting, in Gaza, and that this sort of like endless war approach really wasn't working for a lot of the Israelis. My sense, for what it's worth, is that this is a kind of collapse that we're starting to see in the Middle East, and we're starting to see it among people that kind of tie in with the Israeli network. And meanwhile, we're about to elect the first Muslim mayor of a major city in the United States, or at least, that I can recall. And this Mamdani election, I think, is going to be a sign that the sort of Jewish middlemen, or the Israeli middlemen to the Middle East, that's sort of collapsing as well. And I think, of course, it's one of those situations where the politicians are kind of the last to know. And it's pretty interesting. We're sort of in a moment that I think is going to be one of the more fascinating ones to look back upon. I think it is interesting to me that, so we had sort of several stories at once. We had a story about how there was an assassination nest that could potentially kill Trump. And of course, that became public. That was a sort of interesting thing to have come out when it did. Trump has been sort of beefing with Bibi behind the scenes and even somewhat in front of the scenes, which is a sort of unusual thing. My contention is that Netanyahu, the Trump regime was kind of cool to have the Palestinians get killed. But the second Qatar was threatened, the second Qatar threatened to take money out of the United States, that's when everything sort of changed. Because at a certain point, Witkoff and Jared both have money that come from Qatar. So the second you threaten these guys' money, that's when things start to change. And I think this is a lesson that I think a lot of other leaders in the region and elsewhere are sort of paying attention to. We saw the $2 billion, in effect, bribe that Witkoff's son was paid by the UAE through their weird crypto company. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that kind of stuff in the future as well. Now, it seems to me, and by the way, if people want to come up, they want to join in the conversation, I kind of don't want to do this entirely alone, but happy to sort of take questions as well. The No Kings protest was a kind of interesting development. I was driving around. I had sort of a sick friend that I was taking care of, so I didn't actually end up going to any of the protests. But I did find the whole experience kind of interesting to watch. I know that there's some numbers that say that there are more people who are out protesting Trump in 2025 than in 2017. I'm always leery about when you kind of do this whole no kings game, that you might in effect actually create the conditions to bring about a king. And certainly we saw that with some of the memeing, that went on, where had the crown that was stolen from the Louvre, and then somehow it was stolen by Zelensky, and Zelensky gives the crown to Trump, and Trump gets the crown and gives Zelensky tomahawks. And there's sort of this sort of like pantomime of the whole thing. It's very clear to me that that kings, like when we talk about a king, we're talking about a kind of unitary executive, a kind of powerful, figure. And that really, Trump has not really shown any interest in really doing that kind of thing. And if he really were as powerful as people thought, then he would do a much better job in a lot of ways, in terms of his personnel, in terms of, getting the economy going. He's a sort of kind of lazy king, if you will. And there's a sort of danger here that the protests will be used by other players as a kind of leverage point against Trump, in much the same way that the impeachment hearings were a kind of Netanyahu play to sort of hem Trump in. And I think a lot of impeachments, we've sort of seen that historically, where impeachments are used as a way to sort of punish presidents that don't really get along with the Netanyahu regime. And you saw that obviously with the Monica Lewinsky situation, and I think you saw that certainly with the first Trump setup as well. I thought that was an extremely interesting kind of time with the impeachment. It's sort of like what was that all about? Like that Ukraine impeachment. Looking back on it now, it sort of hasn't really stood up, and of course there's the questions there about like to what extent is Zelensky a product of the kind of Jewish, Odessa mob that, is sort of implicated in this whole setup. And to what extent is us supplying these weapons a kind of, arming of a mob state against the Russians? And of course, the question I have is where does it all kind of end up? My sense is that I think both Zelensky and Putin are playing both sides. They're sort of playing the Europeans with the Zelensky side, and the Russians are playing the Chinese. And it's a sort of proxy war, kind of Spanish Civil War circa 1930s, where you've got, the sort of Franco types versus the communists, and it's a kind of proxy war. Now, my sense is that nobody really wants to fight this war. And this is, I think, why the casualty count has kind of decreased lately. And it's a way in which a lot of different countries can try out a lot of technology that they hadn't hitherto used. And I think that this is sort of something that we're seeing, obviously, with the use of all these different drones. And my sense of it, for what it's worth, is that the U.S. should obviously continue to arm the Ukrainians, but we should be kind of mindful that the Ukrainians don't necessarily have our best interests at heart, nor obviously do the Russians. So it's a sort of situation where I think it's going to be like the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, where it's going to be like a pity that both sides can't lose. And in a certain sense, both sides are kind of losing. Um, the lines have maintained relative stability. You somewhat wonder if it's just all kind of a game to get different countries to pour in resources to make these two parts of the world like relevant and interesting. And I don't really buy the contention that Russia's economy is in the shitter. But even if it were, it's not clear to me that the Russian public at large would actually protest. If you look at like conditions in Moscow, conditions in St. Petersburg, kind of the major cities, things are going very well. It's all the non-white Russian ethnics that are dying. Your sort of Kyrgyz, your Kalimnikas, all these sort of like non-white kind of Turkic Russians that are being killed. And it's a kind of depopulation strategy. Now, people have been asking a lot about this Gavin Wax setup. We sort of talked about this in the last podcast. I want to be kind of charitable to Gavin, but it's very hard to be charitable to him. I think that what we're having here is we're kind of creating a kind of new politics whereby people leak private messages as a kind of like career assassination technique. And I think it's particularly bad when people do that in a time when we're kind of entering a recession, because it's literally breaking somebody's rice bowl, and it's not something that I necessarily support. I do think that, like, it is kind of disturbing, the kind of like casually racist, casually sexist, casually anti-Semitic things being thrown about in these group chats, but they are kind of private communications, and it's not like it really matters to a large extent what these people actually believe. It doesn't really, like I had a plumber, recently who was a flat earther. It doesn't really matter as long as he unclogs the pipe, right? So there's a certain sense in which like it doesn't really matter what all these like kids basically believe. It does feed into a kind of paranoia that like all the kids are secretly groypers. But I think it's really kind of like when black people use the N word amongst each other, or when certain people like speak a certain way in an in crowd kind of way. I think that's really what's happening among a lot of like these young right wingers. I certainly experienced some of this back when I was more kind of right wing. The Democrats don't really talk this way. It's sort of a different kind of approach. They're sort of much more like trying to make sure they're all in line with each other, and kind of like they extort each other in different ways socially. So my kind of read on it, for what it's worth, is that the Wax thing was a kind of resignation that needed to happen. It's always kind of a good idea when people get too familiar with one another and they kind of use language that they regret. It's always a good idea to kind of clean people out. I am somewhat surprised that Darren Beattie has kept him on. I suppose, in a certain sense, at the State Department, I suppose, in a certain sense, he sort of had to do that. And, probably because of his own history, his own connections, his own kind of strange behavior. So I kind of get where that's coming from, but I think we're going to see kind of more of that as time goes on. Let's see here. I see we've got, yeah, go ahead, Dystopia.
What's up, Charles? Well, this is your account number 1000.
Yeah, I don't know which number it is now, but it's somewhere up there.
Yeah. Now, if you, I did read what you said about that. Maybe they were not gonna get paid with Koff and Kushner. Of course, a few days before, is it the EA Sports, the Saudis did help Kushner. But why would Israel do the same? Why would Israel also fund these guys? Why?
Well, it's probably because they don't have anywhere near the amount of resources that the Middle East does in terms of Israel is not an energy producing place. It effectively has just spyware as an industry. It doesn't even increasingly have that because the U.S. is limiting some of that. You can kind of see that with the NSO Group lawsuit over how they're banned from accessing Meta. So I guess the way I would put it is, I think Qatar, as there's only like 200,000 Qataris, right? It's like not that many Qataris, and they're very, very wealthy. And so, part of the reason they throw the money around is to make sure that people have an interest in making sure that Qatar stays a free and independent country. And, here we have a situation where the Israelis are attacking Qatar, attacking, supposedly Hamas leadership in Qatar. And the United States has asked for Qatar to host these people, and here the Israelis are trying to kill them. And we saw this in the past where the Israelis were trying to kill negotiators in the Iran deal. I think actually they ended up killing them. And so we have a sort of situation where we have a rogue group of Israelis running around murdering people in the Middle East. And this, of course, makes everybody very uncomfortable in the region. And I think what ended up happening is that Witkoff and Kushner were sort of, in a situation where the Qataris were threatening to kind of pull their money back or pull support back from the United States. And, Trump, of course, didn't want to see that happen. So Trump, in effect, forced the Israelis to apologize, Netanyahu to apologize to the Emir of Qatar. And, of course, you're seeing the Turks were heavily involved. And the Turks, of course, today there's a whole situation where they're discussing, basically Qatar getting, giving the sort of fighter jets for Turkey ahead of when their own Khan fighter jets are produced. So I think what we saw is a kind of Israeli attempt to reset the negotiations by killing these supposed Hamas leaders, and that they failed. They killed only a handful of them. And then this, in turn, threatened to put Hamas underground. And, of course, that wasn't going to work. So I think what ended up happening is just a practical matter, is I think we're in a situation where, we don't really talk about what caused October 7th. And, one of the things that's pretty clear is if you were following the news around October 7th, 2023, you would have noticed that there was an attack on, like a few days before it, there was an attack on the Turkish parliament by a kind of Kurdish fighter, a kind of Kurdish kind of terrorist figure. And the question was always, to what extent is Hamas backed by, Qatar? To what extent is it backed by Turkey? To what extent are those kind of, regional players kind of involved in what's going on in Gaza? And I think the answer is they were. I think there was a kind of payback for the Kurds attacking that Turkish parliament. Now, I don't think it sort of got out of hand. It sort of got too crazy. Obviously, there's the questions about the Hannibal Doctrine, of whether or not the Israelis themselves killed a bunch of civilians on the border there, which is, I think, a pretty open question. Like, I think we should still take that very seriously. But my kind of read on it is that by attacking the money source, by attacking Qatar, which has been, sort of an extremely helpful ally, one of the largest gas producers in the world, by attacking Qatar, it really kind of changed the dynamics because it forced the Brits were very pissed off about that. They've already recognized Palestine. The Brits obviously have a relationship with Qatar that goes back quite a ways, and of course the French have a relationship there. So pretty much all of our allies really depend on Qatar, not falling, not withdrawing, and I think that attack kind of triggered Trump, forcing Netanyahu's hand. And we're sort of in a situation now where obviously the Israelis would rather get back to it, back to killing people, back to causing lots of trouble. But here we are. Here we are right now. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting question.
Now, what about those who say that Israel could not have done that without prior knowledge from the United States?
Well, the question is, who in the United States would have told them, right? Who would have told the Hamas players that?
No,
And
I mean,
yeah,
did America's approval, Israel did that, do that, but it just failed because they did not kill the guys. Then America said, okay, you know what, Israel, let's not do that.
well, the question, I mean, obviously, we saw Netanyahu and others say very publicly that they chose to act alone on that matter. So I don't know. I mean, my sense of it, for what it's worth, is that they were incompetent and they failed to kill them. That's kind of my sense of it, for what it's worth. So make of that what you will. I think, my just general sense on it is that the Israeli approach of basically using the Abraham Accords as a kind of way of enriching themselves and kind of building parallel tracks where they can get money from the Middle Eastern countries, that's kind of done now. And it seems pretty likely that, Egyptian and Qatari and Turkish, soldiers and units will be deployed in Gaza. And, the United States doesn't really want to do this. I think very likely the Turks will do it. And that's kind of where things are going to stand. And as soon as Turkey gets as soon as they get the fighter jets and other sort of supporting things that they need for air superiority in the Middle East, I think it's just a matter of time before the Turks, in effect, put Israel back in a kind of box, and that the Israeli state is actually much weaker than it would historically appear. So I think Erdogan has basically played the whole situation pretty masterfully. And I think you can see this in Syria, as they're taking the government there is no longer being sanctioned. There's sort of lots of things on the move in the Middle East, and I think all of it is pointing in a direction of a weaker Israeli power. And I think when we see Mamdani win, in November, it's going to effectively be the close of a relationship that had previously existed there, of a kind of Israeli Jewish power dominating a lot of American politics. Now, the question I have is, will Schumer resign? Will he stay on? Will he be enfeebled? Like, what's the story there? I think it's kind of unclear at the moment. I don't know if you guys saw the 60 Minutes kind of thing, but it was quite something to watch. Jared Kushner is saying that it looked like an atomic bomb went off in Gaza. And then he was asked, very pointedly by Stahl, like, was it a genocide? Is it a genocide? And he's like, oh, no, it's not a genocide. Well, it's like, all right, is it an atomic bomb, or like, what is it? What's going on there? And so, my read on it is that it was a kind of mouthpiece play to kind of make Witkoff and Kushner look good. And I think the more, as time goes on, the more of this stuff kind of comes out, the more it kind of like is revealed, the less it kind of looks good for the Israeli cause. I think when all is said and done and we see the real casualty count from this conflict, it's going to be very hard for people to ignore what happened here. And I think there'll be this question of, like, to what extent is the United States going to continue to do this? So next up on this list, we have a sort of discussion about George Santos, or as I've called him, Curious George, which is, of course, a somewhat of a tongue-in-cheek reference to the Man with the Yellow Hat and the Curious George stuff, but a kind of guy who always a little monkey who always gets himself into trouble. That's kind of my impression of George Santos. I do think we have to kind of ask obvious questions here, though, about like why it was that George was put in the shoe. and sort of thing that supposedly there was a threat against him. And I called one of George's lawyers and one of his friends the other night to talk about this. But supposedly there was a threat against George that forced him into the shoe. And this threat was made clear by Project Veritas post O'Keefe. So when the company, this sort of organization was taken over post O'Keefe, they were sort of making it clear to people around George that there was a kind of threat against George, and so he was put into this. Basically, he was kind of put into this solitary, confinement. And of course, George is a very social guy. That would have been probably torture for him. And so one kind of wonders why that was the case. Why was it necessary to kind of make him depressed, make him so that he was afraid for where he was? How real was that threat? These, I think, are very interesting questions that should really get probed. I have always wondered to what extent, supposedly there's a big victim of George Santos, and that victim is supposedly the NRCC, the National Republican Congressional Committee, from which he supposedly stole 170 grand. Well, isn't the point of the NRCC to elect Republicans? And didn't George Santos defy all expectations and get elected as a Republican in the district that he was in? So I suppose the question is to what extent was there an actual victim? And then there's the sort of larger looming question, which is one of the people that he supposedly ripped off was this guy named Andrew Intrater. Now, Andrew Intrater is a kind of fascinating figure because he is the cousin of a guy named Victor Vekselberg. And Andrew Intrater and Victor Vekselberg were involved with this thing called Columbus Nova. I don't know if you could find anything on that, Mr. Producer, but Victor Vekselberg, Columbus Nova, maybe put that up in the Jumbotron. It's kind of interesting because this Intrater fellow, is kind of known to Putin, was a kind of pro-Putin player. And, of course, there's that famous photo of George wearing the Russian hat, visiting Moscow. You somewhat wonder if this was a kind of elaborate sting or a kind of way of ripping off some of these Jewish players that are fronts for the Russian regime. And there's always this question that I've had about Santos, which is is he a spy? Is he whose asset is he? Does he really kind of work for the U.S. government? Was the government always going to let George out of jail? These are all kind of questions that I have, and I think it's pretty interesting that he's now out and about, and maybe we'll get a real sense of what he was up to. But I, for one, think it's a great idea. I think it's good that Trump pardons people. It's good that he commutes people's sentences. I think there should be a lot more of that for nonviolent crimes. And I've had that view irrespective of who's been president. And I think it should continue because I think the prison system in the United States is pretty inhumane, pretty messed up in all these ways. And it's not clear to me that we need people in prison. It doesn't really make a lot of sense in a lot of cases if they're nonviolent. Is sort of my just general sense. It's not a place to put people. I do wonder, in the case of George Santos, what is he going to do now? He says he's going to be committed to prison reform. That would be great. But the question, of course, is what's he going to do for work? Is he going to write a book? Is he going to do a streaming series? I mean, he seems like he's sort of cut for reality TV. He sort of seems in that way. I say we have something up in the Jumbotron about how something having to do with Richard Blumenthal, how Blumenthal had made up a lot of his time serving in Vietnam. And there's the sort of view in general that the reason they got rid of George Santos wasn't because he was a fraud. It was because his fraudulent behavior was so on the nose. So many of the things about him were so fake that it kind of made the whole region there, or all of the congressmen, all of the senators, it kind of exposed all of them. And so I think that question is, I think, something that we need to really think through going forward is how much do we actually vet these people? And to what extent does it even matter? In the final analysis, if George continued to vote Republican, it's not clear to me that it really mattered. They needed his vote. They probably shouldn't have kicked him out of Congress. Maybe Mike Johnson would have even more of a wiggle room on the shutdown matter if George were still in Congress. So I think there's this larger question here about to what extent did this first openly gay Republican get elected? I believe he's the first ever openly gay member of Congress who's, non-white. I guess Brazilians aren't white. I don't know him as white or not, but he's certainly off-white. And I think he was in some sense really discriminated against in a very serious way. And it's unfortunate that he was jailed in the first place for what was effectively a victimless crime. Um, Now, I think we should maybe, I don't know if people want to come up and say things, but yeah, I think this, let me see if there's any other big kind of points we want to hit here, Mr. Producer. Um, so we've got yeah, by the way, it's also kind of weird to me. I don't know if anyone else has this experience, but like watching JD Vance like talk about like Christianity in a very like Protestant-y way, even though he's supposedly like some kind of Catholic convert. All of that stuff was very strange to me. There's this sort of thing where they're sending people over. I've heard it said it's like called babysitting. They're sending people over to make sure that Netanyahu behaves himself. My sense of it is that Netanyahu is just going to continue being a criminal, and he's going to continue trying to violate the ceasefire. He's going to try to continue harming Israelis who oppose him and Palestinians just generally. And I think we should be aware of his criminal acts generally, and we should arrest him. And I think to the extent that Canada and other kind of U.S. allies are saying, if Netanyahu arrives here, we're going to arrest him, I think we should consider doing that as well. And I don't think we necessarily need to use UN justification or human rights justification. I think the history is pretty clear that he's, was involved in things like 9/11. He was involved in things like the drug trade in the United States. And certainly, I think there's a lot of questions about his behavior in the U.S. and certainly the behavior of some of his proxies and allies in the U.S. And so this question here of illegal behavior when it comes to paying bribes, which is Foreign Corrupt Practices Act 101. He should go to jail in the U.S. He should get arrested and be brought to justice. And people are like, oh well, we don't really do that kind of thing. It's like the United States all the time topples countries. It's kind of our history. And part of the reason he hasn't been toppled and hasn't been really interfered with is because of the lobby's power in the United States, and also because he's brown, or because he's not brown, rather, he's not a Hispanic or a black, leader, and so that sort of has afforded him some level of privilege. But I think we should probably arrest Netanyahu for some of his crimes in the U.S. next time he comes here, and he's here quite often, so maybe we should get on with that. I see we've got the Russia-Alaska tunnel. Russia's sovereign wealth fund petitions Musk. My read on that is that the Russians know that Musk is in serious trouble. And you can kind of see that with Musk fighting over the Sean Duffy potential takeover at the Department of Transportation of NASA. And Musk in general seems like increasingly unhinged. Like he knows that the gig is up. We saw there's an article recently, I can't remember where it was, but maybe somebody can pull it up and put it up in the Jumbotron or send it to me. But there was an article recently about how some of the SpaceX satellites are also pinging in ways that are unhealthy, and that they're kind of harming, to some extent, they're harming the signal boosts, of other satellites. And of course, there's a handful of countries that would benefit from that. And of course, we saw a lot of scammers have been using Starlink to commit crimes. And there's sort of this obvious question of like, to what extent should scammers be allowed to use Starlink, if at all? I think it's a very kind of open question of like, can we regulate who has access to Starlink? It seems like we should be able to do that, given that the U.S. taxpayers paid for it. My just general sense is that the Russians know that Musk's days are numbered, and I think they were kind of getting a sense of that. They, recently invited Errol Musk, Musk's grandfather, Musk's father, to, to Russia. He went to this. There was some like big ballet that all the Russian influencers went to, and he went to that as well. So I found that kind of interesting, kind of curious, the setup there. My sense is that Musk will be brought to justice sometime late this year, early next, probably involving the Department of Transportation and the sort of investigations into the self-driving car fraud. I suspect the SEC is going to come after him in a serious way. The sort of question of who's going to be the scapegoat for when the stock market finally blows up with this bubble, I think that that's going to be a very open question of whether or not it's going to be, Elon Musk, whether it's going to be Sam Altman, whether or not it's going to be the whole category on the whole. Are they all going to come down? How's it going to shake out? I think all of that is a very open question and something that we should be sort of thinking through as time goes on. Which is not to say, by the way, that I think it would be really cool to have a Russia-Alaska tunnel, and it would be very interesting to have a world in which we could, basically take trains, to the continental landmass of Eurasia. I think that would be kind of amazing and interesting, but I think it's extremely unlikely to happen. I mean, you look at the United States, like how few trains we have, and of course, the question of if we built that kind of trans-Russian American, Alaskan, kind of setup of roads and all that, what would go across it? It doesn't seem like it would necessarily be a good idea to link all of that while the Russia-Ukraine war is going on. It seems like that would be a very bad idea indeed. I think, turning now, I want to say a few things about the Leon Black, Epstein emails, which are fascinating. As you probably know, Leon Black has a relationship with, Drexel. What's Drexel Lambert? I think Drexel Burnham Lambert, something like that, which was a kind of front for a lot of the drug money in the 80s and 90s, and that was sort of involved in sort of taking over companies, trying to change, basically doing corporate raider stuff. And Leon Black very much comes out of that tradition. And he, later sets up Apollo. Apollo has a lot of Russian money behind it, Russian direct investment fund money. I think that that's a kind of interesting angle there that nobody really kind of takes seriously. Um, but yeah, I think that we should sort of be mindful of that history. I think that history is important to kind of take seriously and sort of focus on when we talk about the Leon Black relationship with Epstein. My read is that Epstein was a kind of conduit or facilitator of money from these various governments, that he was kind of watching Leon Black on behalf of, who knows, maybe the Russians. Certainly, it would seem consistent to have it be the Russians, given that the two sources of funds for him in later years was Victor Vekselberg, who we mentioned earlier, who was one of Russia's richest men, who was in business with Ehud Barak and Epstein, bringing money over from Russia. And we should be sort of asking was, Leon Black, who was, Russian direct investment funds, to what extent was he a kind of cutout for the Russians? To what extent was Epstein kind of playing the game of being friendly with the CIA and the Russians, kind of keeping tabs on some of these oligarchs and private empires? I think all of that is kind of worthwhile to pay attention to. Obviously, we saw that Epstein was asking, uh, the former ambassador to Russia, or from Russia to the United States, about these women trying to shake down Leon Black, who were, kind of Russian prostitutes. And obviously, there was a kind of fixer relationship here that I think is kind of useful and interesting to kind of think through. Um, and of course, there's a lot of money transferring back and forth, and it seems like there's a setup coming to kind of sue Leon Black on behalf of some of these victims to kind of claw back some of the money supposedly by these victims. And I think Michael Tracy has made some very interesting arguments. I've made these arguments before about to what extent Virginia Guffey's is an actual victim, and to what extent is that all fake? And I think we should be really mindful that a lot of the people who are involved here are serial fraudsters. Certainly, we saw that with the late, Victoria Guffey's, and I think we should be sort of thinking about that a lot more as time goes on. That to what extent is the Epstein stuff generally about distracting people from what's going on? Now, those emails are pretty interesting. I think people should really read them for themselves and really think through the kind of power that it takes, the kind of chutzpah, if you will, that it would take for somebody like an Epstein to threaten a Leon Black. It seems to me that he had some sort of backing, some sort of larger players involved that were really protecting him and advancing his interests. And then, okay, moving along, you know, I'm probably going to say something bigger about the whole Venezuela thing at some points in the near future. But my read on it is generally speaking, there's a lot of money in the big beautiful bill for like Coast Guard, for border protection, for all of this. There's a lot of drugs that are coming across the border. We should be sort of thinking more seriously about what's going on here when it comes to drugs coming into our country, and to what extent a lot of these countries are on the whole propped up by the kind of drug trade. Now, I do think we should be asking when it comes to things like, tariffs. We're tariffing a lot of these countries that sell goods in the United States. Are we tariffing them because they're also bringing drugs along with the bananas, the strawberries, and other things? Is there something kind of more going on here? My read is that there is, and that this is the kind of like secret history here, that we're kind of limiting a lot of international trade because we realize not only does it take away jobs from Americans, not only is bad for the environment, not only is it causing all these other externalities, but it's also a way in which a lot of drugs get moved as well, and that really we can never really screen everything for drugs that are coming into the country, and that this has become a way in which people like Steve Witkoff's son get killed, doing drugs, and that this has become a kind of increasingly serious issue. And I think to the extent that Trump is using the military to do this, I think it makes for interesting headlines. But there's so many drugs coming in so many different ways into the United States, and I do think as a commander in chief, he does have the authority to kind of disrupt this flow. I don't think it's a kind of law enforcement deal generally, but maybe it is a kind of military intervention. But I certainly think that there are better ways to do this than like blowing up fishing vessels or what have you, assuming, of course, it is a fishing vessel. And now Marco Rubio, has a history here that I think is sort of not really terribly explored. I mean, he has a family connection to the Batista regime. He has a lot of problems historically in Cuba when it comes to kind of these, Castro people, anti-Castro people. He's a very Florida Secretary of State. And I, for one, worry that been a kind of series of trades made by Rubio to kind of ingratiate us with some countries, or basically lie about the situations in those countries. So, as an example, apparently Rubio authorized sending back a number of informants who were involved in penetrating MS-13, and sending those informants back to El Salvador. And given that there's a real serious question as to whether or not, the Bukele regime has cut a deal with the MS-13 crowd, we should be asking, like, what the hell's really going on in this situation? Because I think it's a worthy thing to be focused on. It's a worthy thing to be sort of addressing at this stage. To what extent are we kind of hiding that a lot of our supposed allies in South America and Central America are themselves compromised by the drug trade? And certainly we saw that during the first Trump administration, when one of the presidents, I think this is the one from Honduras, where he was very pro-Zionist, but he was also like involved with the drug trade as well. And to some extent, the drugs are kind of like the only story in a lot of these places where people can actually make any money. And it's sort of like, this idea of like fighting the cartels. Well, it's so endemic throughout Latin America that really blowing up a ship here, blowing up a ship there is kind of not enough to really stop the tide of this stuff. That really we should be focused on, taking over people's bank accounts, doing a lot more intelligence work, legwork, and a lot less kind of showy cowboy gunboat diplomacy. Welcome, future citizen.
Good afternoon, Charles. Very interesting stuff happening right now, especially with the talks that fell through. I'm not sure what you touched on earlier, but yeah, Lavrov breaking up with Rubio. People at the Atlantic Center and the Eurasia Center, they seem to be, I don't know, seem to be more optimistic about this than what most people on the timeline seem to think. They think that this is like this is good for Russia, that they're playing hardball, but really the Atlanticists seem to think that they're just dragging their feet, and Trump is playing this very smartly in their eyes. People like Michael Weiss, as you see up in the header there, as well as Daniel Freed, I believe. They seem to be much more optimistic about this situation. They approve of Rubio, even though, like you said, he may be kind of stuck between multiple camps. They seem to be happy with how he's been playing this, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think as much of that has to do with like their access level to Rubio as it does to like Rubio's actual success levels here. Um, I'm not persuaded that Rubio really has a grasp on a lot of these things. It does seem like a lot of them are kind of spilling out and going a little crazy. I do wonder if maybe though the solution was to tamp down the Middle East conflict, because in some sense, October 7th is Putin's birthday. To some extent, it seems like the whole October 7th incident and the war and everything was a kind of distraction away from the Ukraine conflict, and that this was maybe welcomed in whatever way by Putin. And so now that that has been sort of resolved or at least tamped down, people can kind of focus more strenuously on what's going on with Putin and in Russia. I do think that maybe to an extent, like not having them meet up in Hungary of all places, that was a kind of smart play to not have that engagement there. My sense of it is that Trump is going to go and negotiate some kind of grand deal with the Chinese, and that's going to be the thing that ultimately leads to the end of the conflict. I don't know what that
Yeah,
looks like yet, but that to me is the most likely outcome. And I think it will have a lot to do about punishing Elon Musk. I think Musk will be a kind of scapegoat of that whole setup.
I can see that. Yeah, if you pay attention to what's going on in Argentina, you see a lot of the Russia shills talking about how uh, complaining that we're bailing out Argentina when China has been the one that's been bailing out Argentina since it's become a failed socialist state. Um, and they're also complaining. Our farmers are complaining about um, buying Argentinian beef, which is silly. If you actually pay attention to what Soros top guy Besson is doing down there, and what the IMF World Bank Week is saying, if you've been paying any attention to some of these players, you can see how they're moving and why the Russia people are uh, so irritated, to say the least. But yeah, I see a rapprochement with China happening sooner rather than later, and which goes against everything that the Russian assets on the timeline are saying. And you'll see them get very irritated very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, my view generally is that the Chinese deep state and the American deep state have a lot more in common than people really want to talk about. And my sense is that there's going to be lots of ways in which this will shake out, where China and America will be much more integrated and aligned going forward, and that the tariffs issue, um, will sort of get resolved in different ways. I could see a kind of trade made over a kind of trade being made that would be quite useful, um, between China and America with respect to exporting, these BYD cars into other markets, maybe not the American market, but other places. And I think that that's going to be the story is going to be a kind of trade where we'll take off the tariffs if you stop supplying the drones to Putin at all. Like that would be kind of my sense of how it's going to go down.
Yeah, yeah. BYD, of course, is flooding European markets, South America. Uh, you're seeing that these third countries that are very underdeveloped are some of the largest purchasers of these vehicles, which is interesting. And so I think you're right
By the way, it's not clear to me that that's a bad thing either. In many respects, I think it's probably a good thing. To have a sort of electrification of the global economy, I think is probably a place that the United States and the United States and China can really agree as a kind of way of driving down energy prices across the board. My sense, for what it's worth, is that I also think the Chinese are going to help us, rein in a lot of Silicon Valley misbehavior. And you certainly get the sense that the bubble that's happened, vis-a-vis a lot of the AI stuff, that the Chinese have a real sense of that a lot of this stuff is more or less fake.
Yeah, I think it was Kotkin on Hoover Institute. He said that Jensen Huang is basically running the China policy, which should tell you a lot. Of course, certain agents of Russia are trying to hop in on the hype. Of course, they're trying to grift off it as much as they can, whether it be crypto, with Musk, the electrification. They're trying to diversify their portfolio as much as they can, like you say, because as McCain famously said, they are still mostly a gas station. However, they do have a diverse portfolio in other ways. But like you say, this transition, everyone wants in on this transition, and I think that China is obviously the one to come up on top because they're just simply we just handed them the keys to the manufacturing kingdom, and they're going to benefit the most from it. So I just don't see how Russia can pull off a traditional because you see Colby and all the China hawks that are more Russia friendly trying to pull a traditional Nixon when it's very obvious a reverse is happening. Trump is trying to play China off of Russia, not the other way around. And the players are already in place. They're definitely the ones to win off of this situation.
Yeah, my sense on it, for what it's worth, is I think most of it is fake. So my sense of the conflict is that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is in the main a fake conflict. It's a kind of distraction which is useful to certain players to test out technology. That the casualty numbers down quite significantly, and my sense is that defense tech is going to get blown out in the near term because they can't keep raising this kind of money over and over and over again for companies that don't work and can't get contracts. And my sense is that AI, defense tech, these two stories are going to basically be revealed to be somewhat fake going into the future. That there's sort of there's not really any growth there, and if there's not really any growth there, there's not really any. It won't really be reflected in the market in a meaningful way. So I think the cloud storage story is still real, and I think this accounts for a lot of things. But I think the cloud storage story is used as a pretext to basically get everyone to put their stuff in Oracle or Amazon or Google or Microsoft servers. And the AI story is a kind of lie to get everyone to put all their data there. And that's what's really going on in our economy. And I think people are not really ready for that conversation. But it's very obvious to me that that's what's going to happen. And so I think you're going to see a correction off of the price of a lot of these stocks in the tech sector, but not that much of one because, as people know, AWS was created by the CIA, more or less. And so cloud storage generally was created by the US intelligence community because, obviously the US government and others players have backdoors into all of that stuff. And so what they want is they want everybody to think there's some kind of magic that can be done with their data by storing all their data in these places, and that's really what's going on there. It's not really anything larger than that.
Yeah, if you just listen to what Peter Thiel and the rest of the Silicon Valley says, they say data is the new gold. And you could just see them wearing AI as a mask for just harvesting more data and creating this. Like you said, there'll be a slight correction, but it won't be much. I think that's accurate.
Yeah, my sense on it, for what it's worth, is that that's where things are really going. I also want to be kind of mindful. Let me see if I have it. Yeah, I want to just say a few other quick words here. Yeah, my sense, for what it's worth, is that I do think that there's going to be some kind of grand bargain with China, and that is going to take place soon. I wanted to. I know some people have been asking me a lot about like what's happening with Dallin Oaks and what's happening with the Mormon Church, and I've said a few things about this. I wrote something about that today, in part about Christofferson, and he's the sort of second counselor now, which is one of the kind of right hand men of the new prophet, of the new president of the Mormon Church. And I think that this is going to be an extremely interesting development, because it seems to me that he's very likely to become one of the next prophets of the church, and one of the next. He's certainly in like the inner circle right now. Now, that name may sound familiar to some of you, particularly some of you who are as obsessed with the Watergate, JFK, stuff as I am, Nixon, JFK, period. My sense, for what it's worth, is that Watergate is very much tied in with the JFK assassination, and we can maybe get into that maybe on a separate podcast or separate space. We can kind of go through that in kind of more detail. But Christofferson is interesting because he was a clerk for Judge. I think you say it's Sirica. It's Sirica, and he was a clerk for him, and they were listening to all of the files, basically, of all of the audio files, all the tapes of Nixon, in effect, trying to pay to cover up what had happened at Watergate. And of course, in the Watergate scandal, it wasn't so much the burglary, it was the sort of cover up around the burglary. And I've always found that period to be like very interesting, very kind of useful, and worth paying attention to. What I wanted to do is maybe read a little bit about why I think it matters that Christofferson is there, and sort of go in a little bit about this sort of generally. So this is from my Substack today. These are the sort of just general things that I've been thinking about. So yeah, here we go. This is sort of just general thoughts. So, how Mormon was the plot to take down Nixon? And if so, which Mormons were involved? We know Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist Jack Anderson was Mormon. When he died, the FBI were looking through his files for material concerning the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. To what extent was his reporting simply a Mormon boy leaking stuff from Mossad, or perhaps getting the occasional scoop from the criminal Huntsman family? No one ever really confirmed just who Anderson's sources were, but I think one of them may well have been D. Todd Christofferson, the famous law clerk who had heard Nixon calmly talk about how much it would cost to have the Watergate matter go away. Quote, Judge Sirica and I were shocked as we heard Nixon calmly ask how much money it would take to keep the Watergate burglars quiet, Christofferson said in a June 2017 address to faculty and students at Christ Church College in Oxford, England. The judge and I didn't want to believe what we were hearing. He passed me a note suggesting we rewrite the tape and listen again. Up to this point, we both still hoped that the President of the United States was not really involved, but this was indisputable. Well, why does this matter now? Well, Christofferson was recently elevated into the inner circle of the Mormon Church. He was named a second counselor, meaning it's very possible he could wind up becoming a prophet in his own right. And then I, sort of quote from Kolob in Peace. I don't know if you guys have read his stuff, but his stuff is very good. So Kolob in Peace. Christofferson found himself on the opposite side of Mormon intrigue. John H. Meyer, one of the idea guys behind the Watergate break-ins, was closely associated with Robert Gay and Howard Hughes' Mormon Mafia. Gay had given him a job at the short-lived Hughes Dynamic Software Company, a strange organization that had been founded with Hughes's knowledge. At the same time, the Mormon Church was employing the Robert Mullen Company as their PR firm. The Mullen Company acted as a front for the CIA, was connected to the Howard Hughes Summa Corporation, and employed famous Watergate chief plumber E. Howard Hunt. So yeah, it's kind of interesting just to kind of think through, like, to what extent is the Mormon Church uh, kind of doing all this stuff? To what extent is it sort of like, is the Mormon Church changing, and how should it change? Because, it's losing members at the same time it gets richer and richer year after year. So obviously there's going to be a larger and larger amount of money spread around fewer and fewer Mormons. And so we have somebody who was involved in the Watergate scandal, in effect being the inner circle of how the church is going to make decisions going forward. And I find that an extremely interesting development, maybe one of the more interesting developments on the whole. And so, to what extent, is this Mormon kind of fight over what is in effect a sovereign wealth fund within the United States? To what extent is that fight going to be the fight looming over a lot of our politics going forward? Unless you think it doesn't matter all that much, I mean, the Mormon Church is one of the largest landowners in the United States. I think it's like the second largest, something like that. It owns an awful lot of the stock market. It's very engaged in all kinds of construction, agricultural projects, and of course, it has a sort of foreign policy around the world that is very, very involved. And for those who are unaware, there's obviously the question too of how Mormon Marco Rubio is, who was our Secretary of State. At one point, his family converted to Mormonism, though I think today he's a kind of non-denominational Christian. But there's a sort of lot of questions here about the Mormon moment, the Mormon relationship with Donald Trump, that sort of needs to be more readily addressed. And then one final kind of point. I think I talked about this a little bit. Yeah. So the thieves in the Louvre. My sense of it is that if you look at what was stolen, it was kind of stuff that was to the Napoleonic era. And that had a sort of view of France engaging as a kind of world power. France kind of running around, calling and dictating the terms of Europe. And indeed, France was a kind of global power in that period. Had a foreign policy that involved like doing weird stuff in Mexico, playing out in Latin America. They had sort of global ambitions. So I do wonder to what extent these things that were stolen not so much to like fence them and to basically make money off of them, but as a way of kind of humiliating France. And I think that this was maybe a kind of project that was funded by the Russians or by the Serbians and sort of other players in Europe. Now, what is interesting to me is that it's very hard to commit a crime these days without leaving behind any DNA. And as I'm a backer of this company Othram, which, OTHRAM, which has been involved in solving a number of murders and rapes, where people use very trace amounts of DNA. And I wonder if the French might be smart to use that in this case as well, to kind of identify, who the people are, where they're from. Obviously, there'll be some DNA left behind, even if they use gloves. There'll be sort of material that they can sort of, pick up just from, when you touch something, you leave behind 200 cells of DNA. Even if they're wearing gloves, there's all kinds of hairs, those kind of things and so hopefully the scene won't be too contaminated. Um, any thoughts, future citizen? Any other kind of things you're looking at or focused on?
Well, I was looking around. It looks like Rubio's extended family. He was Mormon. He was I guess, part of his family was a part of a singing group or something
That's
as
right.
kids. But then once they moved to Miami, they become Catholic, which is interesting. Um, yeah, the other thing I'm looking at is Russia's relations in Riyadh, in regards to this Gaza peace plan, or board of peace, whatever Trump is calling it. And it looks like MBS. I think there's some interesting things to be said about Saudi Arabia and the relations between Russia, and also just how much access they have to this sovereign wealth fund, like you say, um, in Saudi Arabia, and how much they gain to benefit from possible peace, quote unquote, happening. And they said all about, basically in name only, as long as Trump declares, even if there's no tangible proof of a two-state solution, that they are fine with with that. That's enough for them to re-engage and sanction the Abraham Accords to move forward, which is interesting. That's what I'm looking at currently.
Yeah, I mean, people don't usually think of Saudi Arabia as a serious player on the geopolitics side of this, but they very much are. I mean, they've sort of become a kind of banking center as well. And I, for one, think that just as the Qataris have backed Kushner and backed Witkoff, the Saudis are all behind Trump and have been for quite a long time. I mean, he has a relationship going back to Jamal Khashoggi, Adnan Khashoggi, the uncle of Jamal Khashoggi, and he has a sort of relationship there that goes back quite a long ways. And I think the sort of role of Saudi Arabia as a sort of financial center, as a place where Russia and America can interact and intersect, all of that I think is quite useful and worth paying attention to, particularly as the price of oil kind of goes down worldwide. I think that approach is going to be very interesting to kind of see as it plays out. My sense is that there's a kind of grand bargain that can be done with Saudi Arabia, China, and America with respect to both the price of oil and with the sort of future of transportation generally, that the Saudis don't want to be left behind. And my sense is that that's kind of where things are really going to go. The UAE seems very neutralized here. You didn't see MBZ go to the Egypt summit. There's this sort of like fear generally that the UAE has around the Muslim Brotherhood. And they, of course, see Turkey and Hamas and to some extent Egypt as a part of that kind of nexus. But it does seem to me that the Saudi kind of connection, the Saudi power, is sort of worth paying attention to in a more serious way. And my sense just generally is that Trump's ability to just sort of tell Netanyahu this conflict is over, get fucked, you're done, is very interesting. Now, we saw that Netanyahu announced that he was going to run for re-election in the 2026 elections in Israel. To what extent, Vance is very much Bibi's guy. As people know, when I leaked those text messages from a year or so back, Vance is very much pro-Bibi, and historically was pro-Bibi. So I think we should be, asking ourselves what may happen here. Is Trump in danger by his policies here? To what extent is Vance going to be the guy that the Netanyahu and Israel bots kind of going forward? And we see here, just as you say, there's a piece in the Wall Street Journal. Saudi Arabia's crown prince will visit Washington, D.C. next month and meet Trump in the Oval Office, capping a multi-year effort to restore his international standing. I think we're going to see a lot more pressure brought to bear here as well. And, I think one of the very interesting things, Syria girl, who I don't know if Syria girl's in here, or Syrian girl is here, but Syria girl, the sort of other, sort of commentator here, makes a big deal about Epstein with MBS. But, I think actually MBS, I've never really bought the Khashoggi assassination being a product of the Saudi government. I share the view that it was a kind of done by rogue actors within Egypt as a kind of punishment over Muslim Brotherhood related issues. And I believe there's a book that's come out by Isabel Vincent and Tom Anderson. I know Tom and Isabel, in effect, arguing as much. And so that was always my kind of sense of things, of what was going on. My sense too is that Saudi Arabia owns an awful lot of Silicon Valley, and they've been a kind of pass through for China, for Russia, for other players. And my sense is that Saudi Arabia is going to start dictating the terms of a lot of Silicon Valley going forward. And I think we need to be sort of thinking about that as time goes on. Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Yeah. So these middle nations are becoming more and more powerful. We see it with Turkey. Nobody thought that these middle powers would come to the fore like you see them now. Like maybe 5 years ago, nobody thought that they would have as much leverage as they do. But you see as they become sort of proxies or pass-throughs, as you say, they are going to continue to become more powerful as they broker this peace deal on behalf of other powers. And the question is that people need to ask themselves is who benefits outside of this, this bifurcation in the Middle East. Because Russia and Ukraine, we in our modern worldview, we think of them as separate than the Middle East conflict, but these are all very interrelated, and it's kind of hard to tell in the fog of war or just who is backing who. But if you follow the money through these sovereign wealth funds, you can see who stands to benefit. But you have to really dig.
Yeah, I think that's quite rightly said. I want to see if there's anyone else wants to come up and speak. Sort of happy to have you. If you want to raise your hand, we're happy to bring you up. If not, I think we've probably gone for about an hour today. We'll probably do this again in a few days' time. Tomorrow is my 37th birthday, which I'm kind of excited about, kind of not excited about. It should be fun. And I am having it at a Turkish restaurant. In light of your Middle Nations kind of hypothesis, I think it'll be fun. If any of you should find yourself in D.C. tomorrow or Northern Virginia area and want to come to it, let me know. Message me, and I'm happy to host you there. Because I see some familiar friends and faces. I think just sort of a parting thought here is I think that we're going to see more and more of these middle nations come to dominate a lot more of the discourse going forward. And it seems likely to me that there's a kind of, as I said before, a kind of Saudi China America deal that's about to be structured. And I think that that's going to be the kind of new guarantor going forward of a lot of what's going to be going on going forward. Obviously, Qatar got a security guarantee from the United States, and it's obviously the case that the Saudis are going to want a similar kind of thing. And so the terms under which that guarantee is given, I think it's going to be something very fascinating to watch. Because are we going to step in if Iran is attacked? Will Israel have an incentive to get that conflict going? All of that I think is going to be very worth paying attention to. And to what extent is Netanyahu going to push back on what's happening here? To what extent can he push back? I think those are going to be open things. But any thoughts, Future?
No, I think that's what to look out for. Also, for those for people that don't see, they find farming policy boring, or just whose stakes are in the lithium triangle. All of these things are very interrelated. If you're willing to understand how bread baskets work and how leverage works, you can see Trump using it.
What's your sense of what's really going on in Argentina? Because obviously, $20 billion is not that much money in the grand scheme of things. I mean, what is your sense that this is? I mean, what's your going on there?
Well, I think Trump he's playing. He's in the diplomatic sphere. He's playing hardball, but it's all with China, right? The whole, but really he's trying to play Russia off of China, and he's going to give China what they want. We've already seen Bessent. I guess he recalled or asked for one of their emissary, one of their trade guys to be sent back home, basically, and China instantly recalled him. I forget his name, but we've been willing to basically break a deal with our soybeans and with our metals, our rare earths in South America. And I think Trump is just going to give everything to them. That's my sense of it. And he's trying to play hardball so that, Russia seem like they can have a chance on the world scene, and that he's not favoring one or the other, but he really is. And we have no choice but to give a slice of South America to China.
Well, I think to some extent the Argentines and the Chinese kind of deserve each other, in a way. That seems like a kind of mismatch that's going to be playing out. My sense on it, for what it's worth, my sense is that there's going to be a deal structured around the future of this transportation, around electric cars generally. And the person who's going to lose out, as I said before, is Elon. Elon is, in effect, going to be kind of quasi-retired. And this is, I think, what explains Sean Duffy taking over NASA. It seems to me that Elon is increasingly not in control of what he claims are his companies. I think that's going to be the sort of story of the next half of Trump's administration,
Well,
is the kind of collapse there.
yeah, if you just see who were the first investors to back Tesla and SpaceX. I mean, this is Russia really just they're trying to diversify their portfolio through Musk. I mean, you can clearly see that. So I think you're right. I think they're going to go straight. They're going to cut out the middleman and go straight to China, give them the deal.
Yeah, and you can kind of see, like, Kuwait, which is like the most kind of Chinese friendly of a lot of the Arab countries. You see there was this electric car that that TOG, Turkey's national electric car manufacturer, he gave them an electric car when he was in Kuwait. And I think you're going to see a lot more of these countries try to be kind of post-petroleum going forward. And obviously Argentina, with all of its silver, with all of its metals, it's obviously going to be an increasingly important country. And to some extent, I think this $20 billion guarantee for the economy there is a kind of way of keeping Argentina as a kind of middle nation of a sort for dealing with China. And sort of thinking through what that will look like. My sense, though, in the U.S. is it's gonna take a while, generally, for people to figure out like how to renegotiate a kind of conversation with China. And I think the people who are in most trouble right now are the people that kind of took AI money or Chinese money like during the last cycle. That's going to continue to be a problem for them. So like I don't see Jared Kushner and Josh Kushner and all these people who like got a bunch of money from the Chinese basically having much staying power, going forward. That as Trump kind of like goes through the system, they're increasingly going to be in a weaker and weaker position as time goes on. And I've heard through some back channels that the Chinese are trying to build their own backdoor with Witkoff, but that they're struggling with some of that. They're sort of not sure how to play that going forward. It seems to me too also that Trump is going to move against India in a serious way soon, and I think we're going to see a lot more pressure brought to bear against India. And I think how that shakes out with Vance's wife being Indian and sort of like involved with kind of the triumphalist Indian immigration crowd, that's going to be a really interesting angle to watch as well, because I think it gets to larger questions at the heart of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, India's Nayara Energy. I think it's basically a joint venture with Russia. It's one of their largest petroleum companies, and yeah, there's going to be increasing sanctions. It says on Reuters that Nayara has been operating its 400,000 barrels per day, Western India, 80% capacity. But like you say, there's going to be increasing pressure, and I don't think India wants to be a part of this growing axis of evil, especially when they could be a part of the quote unquote coalition of the willing. It's just there's more money on the other side of the ledger.
I think that kind of gives us a sense of anything. Mr. Producer, is there anything I should add? Are we good? No? All right. I hope you guys all have a lovely rest of your week, and we'll see you in a couple days' time. Take care.